What other traits do you think you personally have that propels you to be such a successful entrepreneur?
I think, well, people do not think critically enough. I mean, critical thinking is a skill in short supply, where people take too many things they assume too many things to be true without sufficient basis in that belief. So it's very important that people closely analyze what is supposed to be true and try to say let's analyze things from first principles, not by analogy or not by convention. If you assume things are true by convention, which is actually what most people do, then it's difficult to gain insight into how things can be bettered. So, in any argument or any sort of train of thinking, you want to make sure that the underlying premises are valid and applicable, and then in reaching a conclusion, that the conclusion you're reaching is necessarily driven by the underlying premises and the interconnection between those premises. That may seem like a really simple thing to say, but most people don't do that. So it's really the foundation of rational thought.
Right. I do think there's a good framework for thinking is physics. The sort of first principles reasoning. But generally, I think there are. What I mean by that is boil things down to their fundamental truths and reason up from there, as opposed to reasoning by analogy. Through most of our life, we get through life by reasoning by analogy, which essentially means kind of copying what other people do with slight variations. And you have to do that, otherwise it's mentally you wouldn't be able to get through the day. But when you want to do something new, you have to apply the physics approach. Physics is really sort of figuring out how to discover new things that are counterintuitive, like quantum mechanics. It's really counterintuitive. So I think that's an important thing to do. And then also to really pay attention to negative feedback and solicit it, particularly from friends. This may sound like sort of simple advice, but it's hardly anyone does that, and it's incredibly helpful.
And I think it's also important to reason from first principles rather than by analogy. So the normal way that we conduct our lives is we reason by analogy. We're doing this because it's like something else that was done, or it's like what other people are doing.
Me too type ideas.
Yeah,
slight
iterations on a theme, and it's kind of mentally easier to reason by analogy rather than from first principles. But by first principles is kind of a physics way of looking at the world, and what that really means is you kind of boil things down to the most fundamental truths, and say, okay, what are we sure is true, or as sure as possible is true, and then reason up from there. Mm-hmm. That takes a lot more mental energy.
Give me an example of that. Like, what's one thing that you've done that on that you feel has worked for you?
Sure. So somebody could say, in fact people do, that battery packs are really expensive and that's just the way they'll always be, because that's the way they've been in the past. You're like, well, no, that's pretty dumb, because if you applied that reasoning to anything new, then you wouldn't be able to ever get to that new thing.
Right.
It's like you can't say, horses, nobody wants a car because horses are great and we're used to them and they can eat grass. There's lots of grass all over the place, and there's no gasoline that people can buy, so people are never going to get cars.
Right.
But people did say that. And for batteries, they would say, it's going to cost, historically it's cost $600 per kilowatt hour, and so it's not going to be much better than that in the future. And you say, no, okay, well, what are the batteries made of? So first principles would be to say, okay, what are the material constituents of the batteries? What is the spot market value of the material constituents? So you can say, okay, it's got cobalt, nickel, aluminum, carbon, and some polymers for separation, and a seal can. So break that down on a material basis and say, okay, what if we bought that in the London Metal Exchange? What would each of those things cost? Like, it's like $80 per kilowatt hour. Mm-hmm. So clearly, you just need to think of clever ways to take those materials and combine them into the shape of a battery cell, and you can have batteries that are much cheaper than anyone realizes. To what do I attribute my drive to take on such large issues? I want to be involved in issues that will have a significant effect on the future. Let's see. I guess I can probably trace that back to when I was a teenager, and I was trying to figure out what's the meaning of life, and there didn't seem to be any good answer. So it seemed like, well, then in the absence of having a good answer, then we should try to expand the scope and scale of human consciousness in order to better appreciate the nature of the problem that we're trying to solve and figure out what questions to ask. Just like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy with Douglas Adams, he really hit the nail on the head that the really tough part is figuring out what questions to ask. Once you have a properly phrased question, the answer is comparatively easy. So if we're going to do that, then we obviously want to maximize the likely lifespan of humanity and expand beyond Earth, and just sort of get a better understanding of the universe. So I thought I would get involved in things that would do that. When I was studying physics, in physics you're taught to always question yourself. You're taught to always assume that you're wrong, not assume that you're right, and you have to prove yourself not wrong. And so I think that physics framework is really where I learned it, and it's very effective for learning counterintuitive things that aren't obvious. Mm-hmm. I think to be successful at almost anything, you have to do the tough stuff and as well as the enjoyable stuff. You have to do the boring stuff as well as the non-boring stuff. Mm. And if you don't do your chores, then bad things will happen. But if they don't do the things that they don't like to do, then the company will be in trouble. Yeah. Like you have to, you basically, like it's more fun to cook the meal than to clean the dishes. Mm-hmm. Okay, but you need to clean the dishes.
You need to do both.
Yes, you need to do both, exactly. Exactly, when you're building something new, there's going to be mistakes. Yeah. And it's important to recognize those mistakes, acknowledge them, and take corrective action. Okay. And the success of a company is very much more about how quick are you to fix the mistakes, not will you make mistakes.
Or admit the mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you see the difference between a startup that is successful and one that is not, and it's because the successful one, they both made mistakes, but the successful one recognized the mistakes, fixed them very quickly, and the unsuccessful one tries to deny that the mistakes exist.